Good morning. Let the record show that we have a quorum present, and we call the meeting to order at 10:17. This morning we're going to be dealing with Cayman Islands National Museum, Cayman Islands National Cultural Foundation, and after lunch we'll be dealing with the National Gallery of the Cayman Islands. So we'll invite the people in from the Cayman Islands National Museum first.
I'm sorry. Yes. Oh, thank you. I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this honorable legislative assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this honorable legislative assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Good morning, Mrs. Peggy.
Thank you. Good morning, sir.
The first question that you ask, just identify yourself by name and title before you answer for the record, and you'll need to do it once.
Yes.
And you can also introduce the person that you have with you and what role they have, please.
Thank you. Dr. Peggy Leshaker Denton, Director of the Cayman Islands National Museum. I have our contracted financial consultant, Mr. Ronnie Dunn from FinCor, with us. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for coming. And the committee has some questions based on the Auditor General's report, which you will obviously be aware of. So we'll open the floor up for questions. Mr. Austin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to the witnesses.
Good morning.
The Auditor General, in her audit of 30th June 2006, gave a qualified opinion on 2016, gave a qualified opinion on the financial statements regarding to property, plant, and equipment, as well as the completeness of cash receipts from fundraising, income, and donations. They also included an emphasis on matter regarding the museum's dependence on the financial support of the Cayman Islands government to enable it to meet its obligations. Mm-hmm. This was one of those reports, in truth, as I pored over the file, that I found myself asking often, is the Auditor General being a little too picky in their requirements, and whether or not this could have received an unqualified report. However, in the end, I resigned myself to accept that the auditors may only audit in accordance with the law, and in particular the Public Management and Finance law, and therefore I accept that the Auditor General's office had a need to remain consistent in its reporting. However, they also, in their recommendations, offered what I thought were a number of low-hanging fruit which should otherwise ensure, if not guarantee, that at the next audit you have a clean report. And certainly by the recommendations and management response, it seems that we're on our way there. But I am particularly interested, and certainly speaking to my colleagues who are accountants by profession, auditors have a bit of a concern in signing off on your internal controls specific to cash donations. One of the deficiencies in internal controls noted by the Auditor General was internal controls are not adequately documented and monitored to provide assurance that the entity's environment is conducive to adequately capture, record, and report income from donations and fundraising. The response from management was that cash donations account for less than 1% of the museum's total revenue, when in actual fact, if we want to split hairs, it's closer to almost 2%. 1.9% in 2016 and 1.98% in the actual budget figure is closer to 2%. You have, however, committed to correcting this for the 2016-2017 fiscal year. And my question is, could you tell this committee what measures have you implemented? Have you since implemented these measures to adequately record and keep track of cash donations as it is received by the museum?
Do I speak through the chair or directly?
Through the chair.
Oh, okay, yes, thank you.
But you only need to establish that protocol once. You don't have to say that before every sentence. Just
Okay,
once.
okay, thank you. I'm just trying to do it correctly.
she did
Yes,
it.
through the chair, thank you very much for the positive remarks first that you have made about the museum. We do feel that we have been moving progressively forward over the last years. Regarding specifically your points about the cash donations, we derive the primary part of our donations as sponsorships that come via checks. So there is clear tracking there. We have less than about $1,000 that comes in through a cash donation box, for which we do have procedures and forms and a number of people who go through that process with us. We also have a financial policies and procedures manual that has been developed this year and in place. And perhaps I'd like to ask Mr. Dunn to comment a little further on that.
Thank you, Dr. Peggy. Through you, Mr. Chair. The internal controls that were noted within the report were similarly identified by the government's internal audit unit. And in response, the organization did develop a set of internal control policies and procedures. And last year, we sat with the internal audit unit, went through all the policies that were developed and the systems that were in place, and they concluded that they were satisfied that we had met their requirements and the observations that they made. Just to give you an illustration, in 2017, the total amount that came through the cash donation box was $617. It's literally a plexiglass box that is physically screwed onto a podium in the National Museum, and persons drop monies and coins. Sometimes we get pesos, Canadian dollars, all kinds of different currencies in it. The procedure is the keys to that box, which is physically attached to an immovable object, is kept over in the finance manager's office. When the box is to be cleared, two persons go over, physically remove the box from the podium, escort it back to the finance admin office, put all the coins and dollars out on the table, count it all up, verify with each other that this is the amount that came out of the box, sign off on a form that two people sign off on, photocopy, and then it's taken back to the shop and included in the day's deposit. So the internal control procedures for segregation of duties and custody of cash, we've documented it, we've been following it, we have records for it, and the amounts involved is very immaterial when you have revenues of over $1 million, and the amount is a few $100s a year.
Thank you for that. The problem, and I accept all of that, and certainly I noted it in the management's response when they referred to the lockbox and how it is secured. The problem that I think well, I can't speak for the Auditor General, but the problem that I have in reviewing these financial statements is that fundraising income and donations are combined, and they show a figure of $54,801. Certainly not the immaterial number of less than $600 or whatnot, and perhaps it might be advantageous to perhaps separate cash donations from the overall total, so perhaps we can get some context as to the immaterial amount, noting, of course, again, that the law makes certain requirements for internal controls.
Thank you. I think that is a very good suggestion. And I think a substantial portion of the donation that year actually came from DOT, from the fundraising donation.
15 to 16,
Sponsorship.
we actually had, it was the 25th anniversary, and so we had sponsorship from, well, I believe there were 6 major donors who gave us $5,000 each towards our special exhibits and publications, and we also had Walkers gave us funding towards some improvements on the building, the museum building itself.
And so those would have all come through checks, which you would then have an audit trail that you can verify as to their completeness.
Yes, and since that time, we received a good donation from DOT, to which Mr. Dunn was referring for this history of diving exhibit that we have on at present.
Mr. Saunders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, sir. Just looking at the Auditor General's report with regards to deficiency in internal controls. I noticed that there were several of them in terms of journal entries, property, plant, equipment, restricted funds, and contingency reserve. Now, I noticed in the management response, it says with regards to journal entries, and I'll just go through them one by one. They say procedures have been put in place to implement this for the 2016-2017 year. Has those procedures been put in place?
Sir, through the chair, yes, a form has been developed. We'll ask Mr. Dunn to comment further.
Thank you, Director. To the member, yes, the procedure is in place, and I've actually noted that for the majority of the journal entries made for the organization, they relate to prepaid expenses for matters such as insurance, which you would have paid in full at the beginning of the fiscal year, close thereto. But because we report on a monthly basis, then we would accrue it first as prepaid expenses and release it as it's been expended throughout the year. Monthly journals would be made to recognize depreciation expense, wearing out of assets. At the end of the fiscal year, we accrue the audit fees for that year into that year, even though the work isn't physically done until the following year. And then we accrue leave accruals. So there is not a massive amount of journal entries that are affecting other matters, such as accounts payable, receivable, or otherwise. Those go through the subledger as normal procedures. It's just usual end-of-year accounting entries and entries to recognize things like depreciation and prepaid expenses. But to answer your question, yes, there's a procedure in place whereby the journal entries are documented, recorded, and taken to the director for review and sign-off.
Okay, and then the property, plant, and equipment, you said a full register of property, plant, and equipment with reassessments of relevant classes will be implemented by the end of December 2016. That was also done.
Through you, Mr. Chair, it wasn't done completely in 2016, but I think it was early within 2017. Because when you talk about property, plant, and equipment, a couple of things you want to establish: completeness, existence, valuation, condition. So a complete inventory of all equipment, furniture, everything that was movable objects of the museum has been carried out. They've all been labeled, and it's in a register. The issue that continues is around the valuation, which was the basis of the qualification point in the report. Largely, more than 97% of the asset base consists of the leasehold improvements and the permanent exhibits for the organization. I was discussing with the Auditor General briefly, and we will be discussing with the auditors that are going to be auditing the organization as to whether or not the estimates associated with the period of depreciation is correct. The policies within the document refers to leasehold improvement being depreciated between 3 and 30 years. One of the repair works that was carried out less than 20 years ago was to the roof of the organization, and we're already looking to change that. So I'm thinking that the period of time that the depreciation is taking place is too long from a leasehold improvement perspective. So you have $3 million that's going across a 30-year lease in some respects. So we're going to be revisiting that from the first perspective to ensure that the estimates associated with the depreciation rate is correct, and all the records for acquisitions around leasehold improvement since 2010, when this new QuickBooks system is in place, can be substantiated. So I really believe that working with the auditors this year, we should be able to address that qualification point.
Okay, that's cool. And yeah, that's fine. I had something pop up, but just out of curiosity, or the morbid curiosity. Sorry. The artifacts and those stuff you guys have inside, that's not being considered an asset, I mean depreciated. Because I would hate to think you have something 200-300 years old and try to depreciate.
Yeah, there is a note in our the financial statements that, similar to many museums worldwide, the actual objects in the collection are not.
Yeah, that's what I thought, because I'm like, if you have something with 200 years, I mean, that's fine. That's just more for the public.
But sir, if we buy a painting or a thatch basket, that cost is in our books, but not, say, if it becomes a Rembrandt or something, at this stage.
Okay, and just finish up my questions. The restricted funds and the contingency reserve. We noticed that you said you would have those recommendations in place by the end of the calendar year. Were those, was that completed?
Go ahead.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the member, the contingency reserve at $200,000 across the public sector. The goal is to have approximately 90 days of reserve on hand in the event an event occurs which restricts revenue to the organization over a period of time. The $200,000 do not reflect 90 days at this particular time. The intent is to bring it to the board of directors to ask for that to be topped up, as the organization has significantly greater cash overall than the $200,000, to have a true 90-day reserve in line with central government and others. Once that is done, then it will be clarified that that reserve represents a contingency reserve in the event of unforeseen circumstances which restrict revenues. The policies around the restricted funds, whilst there's been some documentation developed since, the reality is the donor, in making those donations to the organization, often set requirements as to what that donation can be used for. And so until the organization meets those requirements, they remain as restricted funds. Now, reviewing it, some of the donations, I believe, came from the government itself, and it has sat there for quite some time. It was under $100,000 for a number of years. This year it went over slightly due to another donation of $3,900 that we received. The intent is, when those requirements set by the donor have been met, the funds will be expended and will move into the revenue or the expense or the asset that it acquires. But until then, we have to honor the wishes of the donor and keep that money separate and restricted, and not otherwise use it for operational expenses.
And this is my final question, Mr. Chairman, and this one is more to the Auditor General's team. I understand, as my colleague from Prospect had raised, that there are some organizations, there's also reluctance to give an unqualified opinion to organization that basically, charitable organization that basically lives on donation from others. I'd just be curious as to what the museum would need to do to make sure that they receive an unqualified opinion, at least by the end of this financial year. Maybe not for 2017, but for 2018. And if that would be possible.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to say at the outset that the three entities we have before us today are all very similar in that they're small, not-for-profit organisations that actually have a lot of cash and cheque, so fundraising and donations. And as Mr. Harris said, we try desperately hard not to be overly picky as auditors, but we are required to audit to standards, and we need to be able to prove the completeness of cash. The second entity that you're seeing this morning, CNCF, have managed to remove that qualification. And I would have said that, had I got a chance to say something at the start, that it feels that the museum are really moving in a positive direction too. And whilst you can't prejudge where the 16-17 audit is going to go and what it's going to find, it feels reassuring, and even more reassuring from the testimony we've heard today. The other thing I was going to add was we contract this audit to Eisner-Ampner, so on the ground it is one that's delivered by a firm, as indeed the next two are as well. I've got with me Garnet and Julius, who oversee Eisner-Ampner, who do two of them, the gallery and the museum, and KPMG, where Garnet oversees them, who do CMCF. So on the specific, they may have more details about where we're actually at with the audit.
Just identify yourself. It's on.
Through you, Mr. Chair, good morning. Julius Aurelio, Audit Manager, Office of the Auditor General. With respect to the donations, as the Auditor General has specified, we are assured by what we've heard today. And in the last audit, we have shared with the museum what we thought was being done in places like the gallery too, which has really stepped up, including putting a camera on its lockbox, which really adds some security. So when we come in, when Eisner-Ampner come in this year, I'm sure they will take a look at the improvements, and we, as we said, we hope to be more assistive of their objectives.
One question: how does the Mr. Jefferson help me here? Is the charitable, the law we passed is the non-profit organization? What's the name of the law? That's what it is, right? Or is it? It used to be, it was first presented as a charities bill, and then it was brought. It was.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to attempt to Google it.
That law has some specific requirements in it. How does that affect what you're doing in your accounting, and are you been made aware of the requirements of that legislation, and will you be in a position to meet the requirements of that legislation?
We have attended a session, on the NGO law. We are, of course, a public authority, so there is some gray area in, we are going to fill out the forms and so forth that we need to do for the NGO law, but it's my understanding that as a public authority, there are considerable controls on us. For instance, the audit itself, that I don't even think is required in the NGO law. But that does require certain methodologies of reporting income and whatnot, as I recall. It's been passed, but none of you wouldn't have been here. Bernie was probably, I think it was passed probably 3 or 4 years ago. I'm trying to remember the exact title, but I think it was non-profit organizations.
Mr. Chairman, the name of the law is the Non-Profit Organizations Law 2017.
Right. The most recent one we talked about was the Charities Law, which is something entirely different. That's to deal with these financial institutions that collect this money that has to be donated to charity or something. But that requires, as I recall, certain specific performance in relation to donations as to source of funds and stuff like that. So you might want to look to make sure that whatever you're doing, and we encourage it, as the Auditor General said, we think you're moving in the right direction. But
Absolutely.
I think that's an added thing that you need to have on your vision screen somewhere about, because you don't want to make all of these corrections and then you get down the road on the next audit, you find that you're not in compliance with some sections of that law.
Thank you. That's, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one final brief personal observation. First, I want to thank the member from Bordentown West for supporting my argument, and likewise to the Auditor General for accepting it. You know, some entities exist to make a profit, other entities exist to serve the national purpose. And I believe the museum serves the latter. The museum is a vital part to any country's national identity. And whilst, perhaps quite rightly so, you may be able to fulfill all of the recommendations as it relates to deficiencies to internal controls, the matter of plant, property, and equipment, I'm not sure how you intend to get over, and certainly how the Auditor General's office tends to reconcile the emphasis of matter that this is an entity that, in order to continue, will require government funding and support. I just want to say to the museum, as I recall from the budget debates back in November, and I think the support the museum received from all members of this honorable House, I don't think the museum needs to worry or feel itself under threat in any way of not being able to operate. I believe the government will continue to support those operations.
Unless we need the money for the port.
But again, I thank the Auditor General for identifying what are a number of low-hanging fruit, and I also acknowledge the museum and you know, the members represented for heeding those recommendations, which I believe will lead towards a clean audit report for 2017. So I thank you very much.
Thank you. We're grateful for your comments and your support. We are an organization in service to society, and we aspire to serve the people.
Any other questions? Any other comments from the... Thank you all very much for coming, and
Thank you,
keep
Mr.
up the
Chair.
good work.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Hopefully next year you'll hand you one of those
We hope so.
certificates that have become so valuable.
Excuse me.
Test, test. Okay, it's a little bit better. a certain age, like you can't see certain colors. And my kids are like, Daddy, it's there, and I'm like, no, it's the color of the dress. And it was like one of the biggest things I took over the internet. But I mean, you looking at it, I'm not offended, but that shit is great. That is great. It's you, where I say that's God in your world. Yeah, no, I think I need to change my actually try to walk in my old glass in this one, because for some strange reason, I can now see clearer stuff in front of me than I could before. And I used to have glasses. Yeah, I think they have improved. I can only like use this not to look across there. But to read now, my old glasses, I used to read and look across. Now, I usually only need to look across.
Have anything to fear. Just read. I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this honorable legislative assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Good morning.
One of these days we're going to get, a good, a light and voice activated mics that are not multi unidirectional. You got to have the in your mouth. Anyway, good morning, Miss Marcia, and thanks for coming.
Good morning, Mr. Miller.
This morning we're dealing with the Cayman National Cultural Foundation, and we have a few questions to ask you based on the Auditor General's report, which you would be aware of, the Auditor General's report you have.
Yes, sir, I have
Okay.
taken a look
All
through,
right.
yes.
When you answer the first question, just identify yourself by name and title, just for the record. You don't need to say it every time, but just do one time, so that it'll be in the records that you were here. So
I will.
I'll open the floor up to questions. Mr. Austin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to Mrs. Muto for being here. This is another one of those reports that I believe perhaps has the potential to avoid a qualified opinion in the future. But I do have some questions because I think the observations of the Auditor General's office are, well, not significant, but important. They offered a qualified opinion as it related to matters relating to internal controls and observed simple things. Like there are no copies of checks, for example, retained or sent back to the bank, and that this could very easily be corrected. I understand that at the Cultural Foundation there are a number of persons wearing a number of hats, but I'm curious to ask whether or not there is a qualified bookkeeper managing the accounts, because in my observation of the Auditor General's report, I believe the recommendations, to my mind, are minor in nature and can be easily corrected through the introduction of simple systems such as a general ledger and overall proper record keeping as it relates to cash deposits and donations. But could you inform this committee as to the skill sets of the individual who may be managing the books at the Cayman National the Cayman Islands National Cultural Foundation, please.
Thank you for your question, sir. Mr. Chairman, through you, my name is Marcia Mutu. I'm the Managing Director of the Cayman National Cultural Foundation. Among my qualifications are a postgraduate degree in arts management. And while the Cultural Foundation does not have a financial officer post to the degree that you have described, we contract qualified independent accounting professionals to assist us with the preparation of the financial statements. On a day-to-day basis, I handle most of the financial matters. And you mentioned the comments from the Auditor General's office, and particularly the one where they stated that there were no copies of checks. Our bank, with which we've been doing business for more than 20 years, stopped sending back the canceled checks a couple of years ago. They used to provide you with the actual canceled checks so that the auditors could go through that and do their checks in that way, that manner. When they stopped doing that, we were no longer in possession of the actual checks. We have since been in contact with the bank. They've advised us that they can provide copies of the checks. It would be at some cost. So we have determined that what we should do in the future is to receive from the auditor, if they agree, a listing of the checks that they would like to see, and then we ask the bank to provide those checks. It will obviously cost us, but it would be less expensive than having them provide copies of every single check that we have written over the course of a year. They do have, however, the ability to look at the check stubs, which we do have in our possession throughout the year. So if there's something that they'd like to check in that manner, they're able to do so.
But I don't think that is the Auditor General's concern. Auditor General's concern is whether the checks over $1,000 have two signatures before they qualify for the bank.
I do not believe that concern was expressed in the financial statements. There is a system in place that once the check is over $1,000, it must have two signatures. That is on record with the bank, and in each and every case, they will have found that we have always had more than one signature on all checks over $1,000.
But although the bank, because there are instances that we're aware the bank has paid out checks that require two signatures on one signature. So I think that part of this is that they need to know that the check was signed by two people.
Through you, Mr. Chair, Garnet Harrison, Auditor General's Office. In regards to this, it is exactly looking at that control and seeing if those two signatures are there as well. From obviously the check stub, we can't see that, and from other things. So we need to, in essence, and this is again not done by us directly, it's done by another audit firm. So we're relying on what their test procedures are. But from what I understand, is they're wanting to take a look at those checks to make sure the amount is the same as what it was written for, and also for the signatories, that they can verify both signatories.
Well, as I said, I can guarantee that you will be able to get that information, because as long as you tell us which checks you would like to see, because obviously the auditor takes a sample, we can have those come from the bank. They will make photocopies for us so that you can be assured that not only did the check leave us with two signatures, that very check actually was processed through the bank.
So,
the response about copying the checks before they're sent off would probably
That's what I was
suffice
going to
rather than
suggest.
incur any costs, because the last thing we want to do is make it difficult.
So
But
you
we
said
need
that-
to comply with standards and
Yeah.
ensure controls are in place. So the response at the bottom line about copying them before they're once they're signed would probably suffice.
I think it's important just to recognize that cash in any audit is always considered high risk. And as such, the controls around cash has got to be above that of pretty much any other asset you have. I going to join my colleague from Prospect. I guess where I'm a little bit of my reservations is that any qualified accountant that you employ to do this This is like basic 101 accounting. And I would say to you, when you go back, to have that conversation with whoever you are contracting with. Because some of the other errors that have been noticed are not the work of a qualified accountant, at least at this level. Because at the end of the day, one of the things I look at also in my consideration is also the size of the entity. With $180,000 in cash and roughly $1 million in expenses, I mean, this is now considered $1 million business. And as such, the controls that we would expect to have in place for $1 million business would be a little bit more robust. So I think the Auditor General's recommendation in terms of photocopying is spot on, because at the end of the day, we in this position shouldn't be relying on any bank to send over anything we need. Every evidence of every transaction should always be available within the business and not just something for us to send to. So that, I think, is more on your finance team, and I'm sorry whoever it is isn't here with you today to actually comment in terms of what it is that they're doing, because these are more financial transactions in nature and the controls that go with those.
Point taken.
Continue. And the other one is, have you corrected the matters about the accrual balances and stuff in the accounts?
Yes, we have. That was a situation where the insurance premium, the bill is stated in a different time period than the full financial year. And there was an error in a 3-month portion of that. We had not accrued it to the correct financial year, which was immediately corrected once it was pointed out.
And any differences or inadequacies based on your ownership agreement with government, those have been addressed for the 16-17 accounts?
They have indeed, yes.
Any other question? Okay, well, thank you very much, Mrs. Mutu, for coming. That's all the questions we have for you at this point in time.
Thank you so much. May I be excused, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, of course.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
go
you.
ahead.